last week about verse 11. He's telling them and he's telling us once again, Israel's salvation is like a new Exodus. In Exodus, we're familiar with the plagues. We're familiar with them going across the sea. We're familiar with them going into the wilderness and all of that. Well, he uses some of that language and talks about them being redeemed from their new kind of Exodus, but this time the oppressor is Babylon rather than Egypt. And so in Isaiah 58, we'll pick up in verse 8. He says, the light's going to break forth as the morning. He says that your health will spring forth speedily, and your righteousness will go before thee. The glory of the Lord will be your reward. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord will answer. Thou shalt cry, and He's going to say, here I am. And then in verse 9, if you take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger, the speaking of vanity, and you draw out your soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. So He's going to shine forth out of a dark time. They're living in exile, so it's all dark for them. Everything looks depressing. They're sitting in a time of suffering and pain. And so He speaks to them out of that. And He says in verse 11, the Lord will guide you continually, quite like He did with the fire at night and the cloud by day. He's talking about that kind of thing happening again. It's not literal, of course, but He's telling them, I'll be your guide. I'll be the shepherd that will lead you through all of this. And so He says in verse 11, and you will be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water whose waters fail not. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Now, we talked a little bit about this. Let me tell you, Isaiah is still our author. He's writing in the 8th century BC. So in his own day, you had Assyria in Isaiah's own day moved down. And we talked earlier in our class, here's the city of Jerusalem. Assyria had moved down and taken 200,150 captives and destroyed 46 of their cities. Sennacherib did this sort of thing. Sargon did this sort of thing. We've read about them earlier in the text of Isaiah. Well, as Isaiah is writing, he's telling them about a time of hope. And so naturally, one of the things he tells them about is when all of their cities will be rebuilt. And so you're going to get a new city. You're going to get a new town. You're going to get a new land, a new deliverance. All of this is what he's talking about. They're going back home. And God's going to redeem them. Now you might say, well, why are we studying this? Why are we going to read about God redeeming Israel way back? I mean, this is 2,700 years before our time. Why is this important? Look, God's not going to come to us and tell us personally today, I will redeem you. And so He uses the past to tell us, if He did it with Egypt, He did it with the exiles, you can bet on Him doing it again. And so if you're going through a trial, you're going through a struggle, you can place your money on God being able to deliver you from it. And that's not a guarantee that the struggle is going to be carried out, but it's a guarantee that God's going to be with you in the thing. Maybe you will die. Maybe you will suffer. Maybe there's not going to be any real solution for that. But here's the thing. When we suffer, God is actually putting enough trust in us that we know how to suffer and still live as a Christian. When we suffer, it's actually God's way of trusting us to carry His message through. And if we can't do that, then we need to take a look at the New Testament text, the Old Testament text, and realize that suffering has always been a part of those who are willing to stand for truth. And so in Isaiah 58, he says in verse 12, they shall be of thee that build the old waste places. These old cities are going to be rebuilt. And they shall raise up the foundations of many generations. And thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. Now he says this in 13. If you turn away from your foot, from doing the Sabbath, from keeping the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and you call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and you honor Him, not doing your own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then will you delight yourself in the Lord. Okay, now all of that speaks to them in their own day, doesn't it? Well, let's read it with a modern paraphrase. Go back and take a look at this again in 13. If you turn away your foot from observing the day of the Lord, Sunday, from doing thy pleasure on God's holy day, Sunday, and you call the Sabbath, you call the Lord's day a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, you actually respect it and you actually honor Him, not doing your own ways, Not finding your own pleasure, not speaking your own words, but you actually delight in God's day and doing the things that glorify Him, then you'll find delight in the Lord. You see, some of us look after, and he's not, when he says Sabbath here, let me go ahead and make this point. When he says Sabbath, he means Sabbath. There's no reason for us to transfer this over as though Isaiah is speaking about the Lord's Day. We're making an application point. He's telling them it's time to actually appreciate the Sabbath day of God. They've been looking at it as though it were a burden on them. And so he's telling them it's time to repent and start loving God, appreciating that we have the freedom, the opportunity to come and worship Him on the Sabbath. And so in a parallel circumstance, we're talking about our own lives, you know people who love their money. You know people who love their homes, love their families. You know people who love anything and everything except what is godly. Super Bowl, ball games. That's right. And so we've got to think about what is God getting at. He says then, look at verse 14 again. Then, when you really love God and actually delight in going to church, delight in pleasing Him, delight in being a sufferer for His account, He says, then you'll find real delight in the Lord. I'm one of those who believe, maybe I'm just so naive, and maybe I'm one of those fundamentalists who just hasn't figured out what life's really all about yet. But I'm one of those who believes that without Christianity, you'll never find true happiness. I believe that. And if you don't believe that, talk to me afterwards about it, but I firmly believe it. You will not find real happiness in anything that is rooted in this earthly dimension. And God's trying to get us to look at beyond and look at something else. So he says in 14, and I'll cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken it. There's no turning this promise back. He told them this is going to happen. This is sure. This is a promise. And God's not going to repent for it, and it's bound to happen. And so he's telling them the promise that was made to Jacob, to Abraham, to Isaac, that in them all nations of the earth would be blessed. That promise is going to come to pass. And we're about to read more about it in 59. Any questions or any comments at the end of 58? Okay, take a look at 59, 1 and 2. You've probably heard some preacher sometime, somewhere quote this one. Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save. His ear is not heavy that it cannot hear. But it's iniquity, it's sin that had separated the people and God. And it's your sins that have hid His face from you that He will not hear. People sometimes want to act as though, well, God's to blame. God's the one who pulled Himself back. God's the one who removed Himself from us. Look, I heard one preacher tell the story where he said, you know, my wife and I had one of those old cars, and it was just it had 3 seats, and it was a bench seat there in the front. And he said, when we first started dating, he said, you could count on me being right there behind the wheel and her being right under my right arm. And he said it wasn't too long after that we said, I do. You started to see, her name was Dorothy, started to slip away. Next thing you know, she was sticking her head out the other window. And pretty soon she asked the question. She said, you know, I've started observing, you don't hold me under your arm like you used to. And he looked at her and said, you moved, I didn't. Well, that's true. We moved, God didn't. You see the point? When we're away from God, who moved? God's been there the whole time, extending His hand, saying, I'm not changing. I'm extending my promises to you. You can be here with me. And when we're not with God, it's not His fault. It's ours. And so He's telling the nation that sort of thing. Why are they in Babylon in the first place? You know, one of those guys may have started thinking, well, what are we doing here? Why are we camped out in a foreign city? And God says, you moved. I didn't. Your iniquity separated you. And if we don't see how that resonates with us today, my. Verse 3, he says, your hands, you've defiled them with blood. Your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies. Your tongue has muttered perverseness. All of this, of course, is Old Testament. But, of course, all of it has a New Testament meaning as well. That speaks to us. And so he says in verse 4, where's the guy who calls for justice? Who's the guy that's going to stand up when the crowd says go and do wrong? Who's going to be the guy in the crowd who says, I don't care what the crowd says, I'm doing right? He says in verse 4, what about anybody who pleads for truth, trusts not in vanity? The people were trusting in vanity. They were speaking lies, but God's saying, where's the guy who doesn't trust in vanity? Where's the guy who doesn't trust in the lies? Where's the guy who speaks truth? Who cares about righteousness and judgment and justice? And he says the people in this day, they conceive mischief, and they bring forth iniquity. And then look at this one. He says, they hatch cockatrice eggs. Anybody have another translation there? There you go. Vipers. Yeah, these are snakes' eggs. And they weave the spider's web. And that eateth of their eggs dieth. and that which is crushed breaketh out into a viper. Their lies. They've built their entire religious system, their entire actions, they've built it upon a web of lies. And somehow they get comfort in that. And so he says in verse 6, their webs will not become garments. These things aren't going to cloak their sin. Somebody get John 3:19 for us. John 3:19, this is Christ, of course, speaking in the New Testament. But somebody get John 3:19. I'll actually have another one that you get, James 5:19 and 20.
And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil.
They love darkness rather than light. They were looking for a cloak to cover their sin. They wanted something like a shroud to hide underneath. Sin was getting out, and they said, oh, let's try to cover it up. But then look at this one. Whoever's got James 5:19 and 20, go ahead and read that.
Brethren, if any of you do err from the truth, and one convert him, know that he which converteth a sinner from the error of his ways shall save the soul from death, and shall hide a multitude of sins.
Well, that's in an honorable way. In one sense, I want my sin hidden, but I want it hidden by the blood of Christ. And I don't want it hidden in a way where I'm trying to keep it from God. Jonah tried that nonsense, and it didn't pan out. So we want to be like people, not like Israel, but we want to be people who say, God, I need you to cover my sin in an honorable way, not a cloak over my sin. And so they had a web. They had webs that they had drawn up, these lies, and they were trying to cover their sins with that, and it was patchy. It didn't work. So in 59:6, he says, neither shall they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity, and the act of violence is in their hands. Verse 7, their feet run to evil. They make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Wasting and destruction are in their paths. These aren't honorable guys. He says in 8, the way of peace they know not. There's no judgment in their goings. They have made them crooked paths. Whosoever goeth therein shall not know peace. This sounds dark, doesn't it? It sounds bleak. These are not the kind of people you want for friends. And so he starts this new section in the text. He says in verse 9, therefore is judgment far from us, neither doth justice overtake us. We wait for light, but behold obscurity, for brightness, but we walk in darkness. And here they start finally confessing, the righteous people finally start confessing their guilt. You see, in 59:9, they finally start getting with it, and they start saying, here's our problem. We're not owning up and taking responsibility for our actions, for our sins. They're still trying to blame God and to think, well, if only He would give us something more tolerable than the Sabbath. If only He'd make worship a little more fun. If only He'd make that preacher speak a little better and maybe a little more intelligent. And we come up with a plethora of excuses as to why we're not faithful to God. But the righteous remnant finally gets with it and they say, it's time for us to take responsibility. Look, then when the day of judgment comes, there's not going to be anybody standing between me and God other than myself. And if there's a reason that I go to hell, it will be because of Drew Leonard. So away with blaming our parents. Away with blaming our friends, our family, our colleagues. Away with all of that. It's time for us to take responsibility and start saying, it's my duty to serve God. And that's what God's trying to get through to the people that day in Isaiah's time. And so he says in verse 10, we grope for the wall like the blind. You've seen people do that sort of thing. They don't have eyesight. And so they're feeling where they go. That's how these people are looking for God, looking for righteousness, and they can't find it. And so he says in verse 10, he says, and we grope as if we didn't even have eyes. We stumble at noonday as in the night. We're in desolate places as dead men. We roar all like bears and mourn like soar like doves. We look for judgment, but there is none, for salvation, but it's far from us. There's no salvation in people who are sinning and saying that they have no sin. They need to come to grips with the fact that God can redeem them and only God. And so he says this. He says this in verse 12. Our transgressions are multiplied before thee. Our sins testify against us. Our transgressions are with us. And as for our iniquities, we know them. You ever seen somebody who's ill act like he's not ill? He's hacking his head off and he acts like he's not got a problem. You ever seen somebody lying in a hospital bed and they say, oh, well, it's all in the mind. I had an uncle, crazy uncle. Man, this guy. He, age 18, was in full body cast, snowboarding down the mountain. Years later, broke his leg and blamed it on a woman cutting him off. Didn't happen. Next year went out, took his son, went skiing again, tore his ACL in his other leg. Bad stuff, bad decisions in a lot of cases. And he went to the hospital room. He was laying there with 3 metal rods sticking out of his leg. He's doped up. And I said, well, I said, how you doing? He said, oh, pain's all in the mind. I thought, my. No, people in that shape know their condition, you see. Honest people know their condition, don't they? It doesn't look real good when you got pins popping out of your legs and you're doped up. We know our condition. These people are honest enough to say we're threatened by sin. Sin has overtaken our lives and we can't make anything out of it. And so he says this in 13. In transgressing and lying against the Lord and departing away from our God, speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving and uttering from the heart words of falsehood. Some of them have been saying, oh, we don't have a problem here. And in verse 14 he says, judgment is turned away backward, and justice stands afar off. For truth, he paints truth as though it was this fallen warrior, this hero, a valiant soldier that's out there on the battle lines. And he says this about truth. He says, truth is fallen in the street. Somebody cast truth out, killed him, and threw him in the street. And equity, fairness, cannot enter. He says, truth faileth, and he that departs from evil maketh himself a prey. And the Lord saw it. And it displeased him that there was no judgment. The Lord watched all of this. When you go through trials in your life, and I go through trials in mine, and each of us only knows a fraction of what the other goes through. But when we're going through it, look at what that says again. It says the Lord watched it. The Lord saw it. And he's watching the whole thing happen. And he's saying this, don't fret about it. Just be faithful and I'll be with you. And so he says this in verse 16. He saw that there was no man. Wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore his arm brought salvation unto him. And his righteousness, it sustained him. In this text, it pictures God as gearing up, as slapping on the armor of God, as it were, and walking out against all of these goons that are not up for justice and righteousness and truth. And God goes out and he says, if nobody else in this nation can deal with it, I'll take it into my own hands. And he walks out, as it were, with the helmet of salvation on, the breastplate of righteousness, the sword of the Spirit, the shield of faith, and everything else that's mentioned in Ephesians 6. And he goes out and takes care of it himself. Who do you want to be on the side of now? The people being cast down, telling lies, perverting judgment and justice? Or do you want to be on the side of this valiant warrior God who comes out to deal with the problem? You know where you stand. And so he says this in verse 17. He put on the righteousness as a breastplate, helmet of salvation. He put on the garments of vengeance and was clad with zeal as a cloak. He goes out in the way that we would want him to, as a mighty God, ready to fight. And he says this in 18. According to their deeds, accordingly he will repay. That kind of rhetoric is grabbed all over the text, all over the New Testament and Old Testament, where he says, when the day of judgment comes, you're going to give you an answer for your own deeds. And so he says, fury to his adversaries, recompense, fair reward to the enemies, to the islands, the Gentile nations that have oppressed Israel, that is. He will repay recompense. And then he says this, here's what's going to happen. When these, look, it doesn't matter that we've been talking about Assyria, and Assyria then left, and Assyria got kicked by God, and, really, about 686-ish, somewhere in there. And Assyria is out. And then years later, another guy came on the scene, Nebuchadnezzar, and it was Babylon, and he actually destroyed the temple. It doesn't matter that it's Assyria, it doesn't matter that it's Babylon, you put whatever name you want here. What God says is this, when I deal with the oppressor, and I deal with the villains, and I deal with the people oppressing you in your lives, he says, then they're going to know this. Look at it in 19. He says, then they'll fear the name of the Lord. You ever heard of a story? And this doesn't say anything about who's right or wrong, but isn't it interesting? You ever heard of a story of a man who gets cast into prison for something he didn't do? He's the lowest of the low. And then even within the prison, he gains prominence and he starts to take over being the keeper of the jail. And then he leaves the jail and he starts to be somewhat of a right-hand man to the king. And then after all that, the king says, I'm actually going to make you second in command. The only person that holds sway over you is me. Yeah, we know that story, don't we? Who am I talking about? Joseph. When this kind of thing happens to us, people will know that they ought to be fearing the name of the Lord. You ever heard of the man in our modern day then who lost his job because of his faith? And the next thing you know, he's making twice what he was making before. You ever heard of the man who gets persecuted because he's one of those Jesus guys? And that just doesn't go along well with this modern etiquette that we're supposed to have about political correctness. And he said something about homosexuality being wrong. And you ever heard of that kind of individual later getting the better of the thing? Look, even if you don't, Daniel 3:16-18, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, even if we don't come out of this fiery furnace, we'll still serve God. And that's the point that we need to be taking from all of this. But there's a case where God's going to have His say no matter what. So maybe you and I, like truth, are dead, lying in the streets. It doesn't matter. God's saying there's going to come a day when they'll fear the name of the Lord. And that's what we need to be taking away from all this. You side with God no matter what the circumstance is. So he says this in 19. They're going to fear the name of the Lord from the west, His glory from the rising of the sun. That's a metaphor for the entire land, from the west to the east, all of it. He says, when the enemy will come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord will lift up a standard or a banner against him. The Lord's leading this pack now. And now we've got these two important passages which get used a couple of times in the New Testament. The Redeemer will come to Zion. And unto them that turn from transgression in Jacob, says the Lord. As for me, this is my covenant with them. My spirit that is upon thee, my words that I put in your mouth. These things won't depart out of your mouth, nor out of the mouth of your seed, nor out of the mouth of your seed's seed. Your children, all of your descendants are going to be saying all this. And he says, the Lord says, from henceforth and from evermore. They're going to be reminded of the covenant that God made with them. They're going to be reminded that a Redeemer is coming. Okay, let's piece all of this together. Somebody get Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Genesis 12. And somebody read 1 through 3. This is Abraham, who's not yet really aware of who God is. But God appears to him and he starts to make this promise. Somebody read it for us. Genesis 12, 1 through 3.
Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto the land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed.
That's it. That is the heart. That crimson thread, that is it, that runs through your entire Bible. In Genesis 12, this kind of thing is constantly getting appealed to throughout your entire Old Testament and then even into the New. And so what happens is God makes a promise to Abraham. It's a universal promise. In you will all nations of the earth be blessed. And so we have a covenant made with Abraham and with his seed. His seed is going to be multiplied, even as it were as the sand on the seashore, so it says. 17, Genesis 17, Genesis 22. But then later we have this event happen at Sinai, as the Ten Commandments are given. And what you have is the covenant that was made with Abraham. It's not removed. It's not hindered. But it's more specific. And it becomes what we might call nationalized in the nation of Israel. God takes that same promise that He had made to Abraham through your seed, and He makes it more specific. It's going to come through the nation of Israel specifically. See, Abraham had other descendants. Remember Ishmael? Remember Keturah in Genesis 25 and all those sons that came out of that? See, Abraham had other children, but God has to specify, well, who's going to be the one that's going to bear all of this? The nation of Israel. And then later, after Israel was there for a while, we had another covenant pop up. None of these, of course, contradicting what He had said to Abraham. It's just a further definition of it. And so He says, we have another covenant come about, and it's called the Davidic covenant. You can see this in texts like Psalm 89, or you might recall that text in 2 Samuel 7, where he says that Solomon would be a descendant, and he's going to set up the temple of the Lord and that sort of thing. He makes a covenant with David that says, I'll never cast you off. And then we're waiting for this time, whenever it may be, where the Messiah is going to come. And that's the era we're looking for. And Isaiah 59 tells us that there's still a Redeemer that's going to come and establish the Abrahamic covenant. And now we turn to Acts chapter 3. And somebody get 25 and 26. Look at this. Isaiah doesn't know who it is. But boy, the apostles help him out. Somebody get Acts 3, 25 and 26.
Ye are the children of the prophets, and of the covenant which God made with our fathers, saying unto Abraham, And in thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed. Unto you first God, having raised up his Son Jesus, sent him to bless you, and turning every one of you away from his iniquities.
Two major things there. The covenant made with Abraham, that's the covenant that Peter is saying is effective while he speaks. I would argue that the covenant of Abraham is still in effect while we're sitting here this evening. It's through Christ that all nations would be blessed. And we're partaking in those blessings if we're in Christ. So says Galatians 3:29, where it says, if you're Abraham's seed, Isaac's seed, you're heirs according to the promise. But then the second thing, in 26, look at what he said again in 3:26 of Acts. He said, and he had turned iniquity away from Jacob. That's exactly what we're hearing in Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59 says the Messiah is coming. After Acts chapter 2, everybody, the apostles, they're all saying this: the Messiah has come. And now what happened at Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, remains even up until this day. The Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant are both still in force as Christ, the seed of both Abraham and David, and a child of Israel, sits upon the throne, though there's been a transformation about the physical nature to that of being a spiritual nature. Do you see that? Look at this. Look at Matthew 1:1. There is no coincidence here. The entire New Testament starts with these words. Somebody read it. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1.
The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
No better way to convince the Jews right at the outset of the New Testament. This is the heir we've been looking for. He's an Israelite. He's of Abraham's lineage. He's of David's lineage. He's the Messiah. And if you have a Redeemer other than this one, Jesus, you don't have a Redeemer at all. That's what the New Testament writers start to insist on. Take a look at one more text. Take a look at Romans 11. Romans 11, 26. We might spend a moment here. We've talked about Romans before. We took Romans together last year. But Romans 11, look at this. Paul is trying to get the Jews to realize that the Gentiles can be saved as well. So I'm going to start a little bit earlier and we'll build up to 26. He says in 11:13, I speak to you, who? Gentiles. He's speaking to the Gentiles. So that's very clear. That's helpful for us. So he starts to tell us that the Gentiles can be saved. How are they going to be saved? Look at this in 11 and verse 20. Because of unbelief, they, the Jews that is, he's talking about the Jews to the Gentiles. He says, because of unbelief, they, the Jews, were broken off. And so he says in 11:20, and you, the Gentiles, you're presently living by faith. And so he tells the Gentiles, be not high-minded, but fear. Don't start to think that you're just God's chosen people now that you can live like hellions and it'll all be okay. He's telling the Gentiles there's a reason that the Jews were cast off. They didn't live by faith. If they don't live by faith, the Gentiles that is, they'll be cast off as well. So he says in 11:23, look at this. And they, the Jews also, if they abide not in their unbelief. In other words, if they give up their faithlessness and say, we're going to trust in God, we're going to trust in the Messiah, what's going to happen to the Jews then? Then they will actually be grafted back into God's branch. And God is able to graft them in again. So here's what Paul's saying up to this point. He is saying that the Jews have been cut off because of faithlessness. The Gentiles are in God's tree because of their faithfulness. And he says, and anybody else that wants to live by faith will be in the tree, and anybody who doesn't want to live by faith will be cast off. He's speaking to the Gentiles, And look at what he says in 26. In 11:26 he says, "And so in this manner, after this way, all Israel will be saved." How is that? By faith. All of Israel, if they want to be saved, it's all of them. It's going to be saved in this manner. They're going to be saved in this manner. By faith. As it is written, and he quotes the passage we're in Isaiah 59:20. And he says, "As it is written, there will come out of Zion the deliverer." Isaiah said that. Paul's saying he's here. It's Jesus Christ. Start living by faith in him. Now, why does he change this? This is a minor thing it may look like in the text, but it's a little more significant than that. Go back to, hold your finger at 11, of course. Hold your finger at Romans 11, but take a look at Isaiah 59:20 again. And we're going to look at this. Do you see a difference in the wording of Isaiah 59:20? It's very small. And the wording of Romans 11:26.
To and from.
The to and the from. The to and the out of. He says in Isaiah 59:20, there shall come, what is it? To Zion. Why do you think he's telling them in Isaiah 59:20 that the Redeemer, the Deliverer, is coming to Zion? Who is he speaking to?
It's his perspective.
That's right, it's perspective. He's speaking to the Jews. But in 11:13 of Romans, who was he speaking to there? Gentiles. And so he's speaking to a different group. And Paul, for a theological purpose, changes the syntax completely and uses quite the opposite preposition and he says, out of Zion. What's he doing? He's reminding these guys not to be high-minded, Romans 11:20, but fear. And he's telling them that their Redeemer, the ones that they were saved through, the ones that you and I are saved through, whether we like it or not, was through a Jewish Messiah. The Redeemer that they had came out of Israel, out of Zion, out of Jerusalem. And so look at this with me. Look at John 4:22, and we'll stop on this point here. John 4:22, somebody get that one right quick. This is that woman at the well. She comes to Jesus. She's the Samaritan lady. And so she's not a Jew, but she's not really a Gentile. She's a half-breed. And in John 4:22, listen to what she has to say, or what Jesus has to say to her, rather. John 4:22, whoever's got it.
You worship, you know not what. We know not, we know what we worship. For salvation is of the Jews.
Whether we like it or not, the Savior that we all have, the Messiah that we all love and serve, is a Jewish figure. And it was always intended, even back in Abraham, and in Moses, and in David, that the salvation of the people would come through one of their own. Okay, any other questions in Isaiah 59 before we move into 60?
Romans 9:6 bears the same thing out when it talks about, says, not as though the word of God had taken none effect, for they are not all Israel, which are of Israel. Showing that the Gentiles, spiritually speaking, we're the spiritual Israel. We're the spiritual Israel. And heirs according to the promise. Let's see.
Little different in my estimation. In my estimation, every time you see the word Israel in the book of Romans, it refers to a physical Israelite. So what I think he's saying in the context of Romans 9 is actually this. I don't think that he's saying that there's a Israel, spiritual Israel, and a physical Israel. But instead, I think Paul's discussion, which is quite obviously to the Jews there, look at 9:3, where he says in 9:3, he says that I'm talking about my kinsmen according to the flesh. I think that Paul has only the Israelites in view at this point. And what he's saying is this. This is physical Israel. And he's not talking about Gentiles. He's not commenting on them at all. But he's saying this. The real Israel that God's been looking for, he's talking to the Jews. The real Israel that he's looking for are those physical Israelites, but they live by faith. So later on, he's going to have a discussion about the Gentiles. But I don't think that's what he's got in mind in 9:6. every time. The word Israel, Israelites, Hebrew, Jew, and any of those words that have those as root words, those words are used 26 times in the book of Romans. And the only time it would be questionable would be Romans 9:6, Romans 2:28, 29, and Romans 11:26. And I think in every case we can argue that he's talking about physical Israel.
Not to be argumentative, but in Romans chapter 8 it says, that is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God.
Right.
They're the Israelites.
Yes, and so he's saying, just because you're here
Right.
doesn't mean you're the children of God living by faith.
Right, and that's why I'm saying this is talking about Christians being, through the promise, through Christ, we are the children of Israel. We are the Israelites, spiritual Israel.
I would agree with that to an extent.
Waldo, you was talking about how you believe that we're still under covenant.
Yeah.
Well, this is what it's saying. We are, but it's through the seed of Abraham, spiritual speaking through Christ.
Yeah, I see the point. I see the point, yeah. Any other comments, questions, additions? Okay, take a look at 60 verse 1. He says, somebody read 1 through 3 for us if you don't mind. Isaiah 61 through 3.
Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and thy glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people, but the Lord shall arise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee. And the Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to thy brightness of thy rising.
Okay, at this point, we have a really big interpretive difficulty. How do we understand what we're about to read? We can understand it one of a couple of ways. We can understand it like this. Here's Isaiah in the 8th century, and he's talking about the redemption from Babylon. And so he's saying after you leave the exile, well, then the kings are going to come back home, just like in the days of David and Solomon. And they're going to see your glory after you leave the exile. And so maybe we should go this way exclusively and say he's talking about that. He's talking about redemption from Babylon. Or maybe we should say, no, I don't think Babylon completely owned up to everything that's stated here and the redemption from it. Maybe we should go a little bit further and say it points to the cross of Christ. And he's talking about the church. And he's talking about that. And we talk about that exclusively. Let me give you a couple of names just of some commentators that you might have heard of who argue one way or the other. Homer Haley argued it this way, that it was exclusively about the cross of Christ. Wayne Jackson argues that it's exclusively about the Christian dispensation, things that started with Jesus. John Willis, who I think is a better Old Testament scholar than these guys, says it's exclusively about Babylon. Now here's interesting thought. I don't think any of these guys have it right. I think they're doing a disservice to the text by flattening it to only speak of one thing. I think he's using both in view. As I've argued extensively in our class up to this point, he is taking what is used here and using it as a model for what is about to come through Christ. So it shouldn't shock us that if he's saying one thing about redemption, we can see that happening here, but he's taking that same redemptive truth and saying it also occurs here. And I'm actually going to argue this. We can actually go a step further and say, if he can speak about redemption from Babylon and sin, I'm going to take it even a step further and say, even to me in my own day, in the 21st century, this literature is still speaking, saying that God redeems those that are faithful. Does that make sense? So we shouldn't flatten the literature to be so historical, but we should look at it as a theological document that's still speaking those same redemptive truths at all times. The God who redeemed us in the Exodus is the same God who's still redeeming us today. Does that make sense?
It would have to.
Yeah.
If we have faith, we have to know that we could be redeemed today just like the Israelites were. I mean, without the faith, as we use as a lace to go through it all, without the faith, we wouldn't have that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, we get into 60 verse 1, and he says, thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. I think there's something there about the people coming out of the exile, that's for sure. But he's talking in a secondary sense, and he does that with all of this. Everything we're reading in Isaiah 40 through 66, those chapters, that tells us that the nation's going to be redeemed stands as a model, as a type. And it embedded within these words, whether Isaiah knew it or not, is a greater deliverance that's yet to come through Jesus. So he says this in 60 verse 2. Behold, the darkness will cover the earth. Gross darkness cover the people. But the Lord will arise upon thee, and his glory will be seen upon you. The Gentiles will come to your light, and kings will come to the brightness of thy rising. All of this was how it was worded back in Joshua 2, 8 through 11. That's how it was worded in 1 Kings 4, 31 through the remainder of the chapter. When David and Solomon sat on the throne, kings came, queens came, and they said, we want to partake in this. Do you remember who the Queen of Sheba was? In 1 Kings chapter 10, you can read of the Queen of Sheba coming and wanting to link herself to Solomon. And she brings gifts and says, I want to hear of his wisdom. In Joshua chapter 2, you hear the people saying, we see what's happening with God and his nation. And Rahab and her family say, let us be part. 1 Kings chapter 5, you've got a king, Tyre and Sidon, named Hiram. And he says, I want to make a league with you. How are you going to tell the Jewish nation that you're going to be top dog again? Speak to them about how it was in David's day. Speak to them about how it was in Solomon's day. He's telling them, I know right now things look dark. You're sitting in Babylon in exile and in a dismal time. But he says, I'm telling you, after this, kings are going to come and want to partake of your blessings again. They're going to see God's glory hovering over the nation. And that's exactly what happens in Ezekiel's text, as it's pictured after the exile, where the glory of the Lord comes back and fills the temple again. Ezekiel 43, 2 through 5. So he says in 60 verse 4, people are going to see this. Just as he said in 59:19, when you leave the exile, people will fear the name of the Lord. They're going to know he did this. He's worthy of glory and honor. And so in verse 5, he says, then you're going to see and flow together. Your heart will fear and be enlarged, because the abundance of the sea will be converted unto thee. The forces of the Gentiles shall come unto thee. Even the Gentiles are going to want to partake in all of this. And so he says in verse 6, the multitude of camels will cover thee. The dromedaries of Midian, Ephah, all they from Sheba shall come. They'll bring gold and incense, and they'll show forth the praises of the Lord. In verse 7, he says, the flocks of Kedar. See, all of this, of course, is something that they would have understood. These are animals, places, all of that in their time. But he's painting a picture for them that they could understand. And all he's saying is redemption, 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 as that message pulses through the land. And so he says in 7, all of these people are going to be gathered to thee. They shall come up with acceptance on mine altar, and I will glorify the house of my glory. Again, I don't think we need to exclusively say, well, this is Zerubbabel and his rebuilding after the exile. But I don't think we need to say exclusively, well, this is talking about Christ and the church either. I think that flattens the literature extremely. I think it's speaking of much more than just one of those. It's speaking of both, and it still speaks to us today. Okay, we'll pick up there and work out some of those thorny details next time. Any closing questions or comments? Okay, we'll pick up in 60 verse